field in action. Pray for them. We dimly discern the modest wreaths of green leaves, now faded and yellow, and the little nosegays of withered flowers attached to the arms of this cross, left there after the departure of the regiment, and undisturbed by any sacrilegious hand. We crossed the Paris road with its double row of trees, which in the night appeared gigantic, and after answering the challenge of the Territorial guarding the approach to C, we entered the village. It appeared to be completely empty, and yet there were 2 battalions of the Territorials quartered there. The moon seemed to be amusing itself by casting the shadows of the houses on one side of the street upon the walls of the other in fantastic shapes. "Dismount!" We had reached the spot where we were to leave our horses. The men quickly unbuckled the blankets which were to help them endure the weary hours of the following night. They slung them over their shoulders, and we set off towards the towing path of the canal. We went very slowly, as we had at least 7 or 8 kilometres before us, and a walk of 8 kilometres for troopers laden and dressed as we were is no light matter. We found the towing path. Walking at that hour of the night is entirely not very alluring. However, the view was not lacking in grandeur. On either side of the canal the dark silhouettes of tall trees stood out against the sky. Their shadows were reflected in the water, which gleamed with a metallic lustre in the moonshine. How calm and silent it was! Who would have thought that we were at war? Not a cannon shot, not a rifle shot disturbed the peace of the night. Yet, as a rule, there were no long intervals between the reports, which reminded us of the serious work at hand. That day it seemed as though some agreement had been come to by both sides to stop killing or trying to kill. However touching such an agreement might be, it would also be somewhat disturbing, for one must always be aware of an enemy who resorts so freely to tricks and traps of every kind. It was as well not to celebrate Christmas too obtrusively. Besides, I did not think that we were the only ones keeping vigil at that hour. From time to time we passed small groups of infantry, haggard, dusty, and heavily laden, marching in ranks with their arms slung by 3s and 4s, without speaking, striding slowly as though they were trying to measure the length of the road. Some of them were carrying curious objects fastened to sticks, pots or big cans, perhaps baskets. Where were they going, or what were they doing? We did not ask. Every man has his own job. If those fellows were going that way, they had their orders, and nobody troubled himself about their object. All was well. The clattering of the chasseurs on the uneven road lent a little life to the picture. Perhaps they were talking together, but if so, it was in an undertone, a whisper almost. And suddenly the enemy let us know that he was also keeping watch. Far ahead of us, near C, a rocket went up into the clear sky and then fell slowly, very slowly, in the form of an intensely brilliant ball, lighting up the surrounding country wonderfully. We knew them well, those formidable German rockets, which seemed as though they would never go out, and shed a pallid and yet blinding light. We knew that as soon as they were lighted, everybody who happened to be within range of the enemy's rifle fire had at once to lie flat on the ground, and not move or raise his head so long as the light was burning. Otherwise shots would be fired from all directions, mowing down the vegetation and cutting up the earth all around him. This time we were well outside the range, and we watched the dazzling star in front of us without halting. "The shepherd's star," said G. solemnly. Strange shepherds indeed must they have been who carried carbines as their crooks, and were provided with cartridges enough to send 120 of their fellow creatures into the next world. The star seemed to hang for a moment some yards from the ground, then slowly, slowly, as though exhausted by its effort, it fell to the ground and went out. The night seemed less clear and less diaphanous. We had now reached the glass-works, and it was there that we were to leave our cooks. No one would have supposed that this large factory lay idle, and that the hundreds of workmen employed there were dispersed. On the contrary, it seemed to have retained all the animation of the prosperous enterprise it had been before the war. It was a large square of massive buildings, almost a miniature town, planted on the side of the canal, like an outlying bastion of the suburbs of R. The low white walls, crowned with tiles, had the stunted appearance of military works, but a nearer view gave rather the illusion of the life in a busy factory at night time. The gateway opened on a courtyard. The furnace fires shining here and there, shadowy forms passed backwards and forwards, enlivening the dim scene with the bustle of a hive. Men came out by fives or sixes, laden with different kinds of burdens, and disappeared into the darkness, making for mysterious goals. In front of the open gate other figures were unloading heavy cases from vans. These quondam glassworks were now a depôt for the Army Supply Service, and a huge kitchen which administered and fed the whole sector of trenches, of which ours formed a part. The Germans knew this, so every day, and many times a day, their guns fired a few salvos of shells on the huge quadrilateral. But our good troopers were none the worse. Instead of working in the large buildings, part of which had already been destroyed by shells, they utilised the vast basements of the factory. There were the stores, and there they had their kitchens, where they worked day and night to supply their comrades in the trenches with the hot, abundant food, which twice a day made them forget for a few minutes the hardships of the cold, the rain, and the mud. Our column halted under the bleak wall. At the wide gateway a sentinel was on duty, standing motionless, muffled in heavy grey cloak, and through it our cooks passed, disappearing into the darkness, under the guidance of the liaison officer of the preceding detachment. Whilst waiting for his return from the journey through the labyrinth, our chasseurs had a short rest before beginning the most difficult part of their journey. The last stage on the way to the trenches we were to occupy. I took the opportunity of talking with an infantry captain who was there, walking up and down with his face buried in a thick muffler, with his hands in his pockets of his heavy overcoat, on the sleeves of which 3 small pieces of gold lace were discernible. "Eh, bien, mon capitaine. Anything new?" "Oh, nothing, except my opinion that you will not be disturbed either to-day or to-morrow. Since yesterday evening they have not fired one shot, and they were singing hymns till midnight. You may be pretty sure they'll redouble their Oremus this Christmas night, so you may sleep soundly." "Unless all this is merely a feint, and to-night—" "Yes, you're right, unless to-night." The column started, and guided by the liaison orderly, we followed the high road for some 100 yards. The shells had transformed it into a series of gorges, peaks, ravines, and hills. We had to jump over big branches cut from the trees by the projectiles. It was a road that would not be a cheerful one on moonless nights. Fortunately for us, that particular night was extremely bright. Everything around us could be distinguished. We could even divine about 1,500 yards to our right the solitary tree, the famous tree, standing alone in the middle of the vast bare plain, which marked the centre of our sector of our trenches, and where I knew I should find the dug-out belonging to the officers of our regiment. I was very much tempted to jump the ditch at the side of the road and cut across the fields to the final point of our march. It would have taken about 20 minutes, and have saved us a long, difficult journey through the communication trench. But our orders were very precise. We were not to take short cuts, even on dark nights, much less on starlit nights. Our chiefs do well to be cautious on our behalf, for it is certain that, though fully alive to the danger of such a route, there was not one of my 100 fellows who would have hesitated to dash across the country to save himself a few 100 yards. We came to the mouth of the approach trench. 4 or 5 huge steps cut into the chalky clay. The frost had made them slippery, and we had to keep close to the edge of the bank to avoid stumbling. Behind me I heard some of the men sliding down heavily, and a din of mess tins rolling away amidst laughter and jokes. A merry heart goes all the way, and I knew my chasseurs would soon pick themselves up and make up for lost time. This was essential, for the approach trench had ramifications and unexpected cross-passages which might have led a laggard astray. We went forward slowly. The communication trench was at right angles to the enemy's trenches. To prevent him from enfilading it with his shells, it had been cut in zigzags, and I hardly know of a more laborious method of progression than that of taking 10 paces to the right, marking a sharp turn, and then taking 10 paces to the left, and so on, in order to cover a distance which, as the crow flies, would not have been more than 1,500 yards. The passage was so narrow that we touched the walls on either side. The moonlight could not reach the ground we trod on, and we stumbled incessantly over the holes and inequalities caused by the late rains and hardened by the frost. Now and again we slid over ice that had formed on the little pools through which our comrades had been paddling for 2 days before, and this was some consolation for the severity of the frost, preferable 100 times to the horrors of the rain. At last we debouched into our trenches, where our predecessors were impatiently waiting for us. 2 days and 2 nights is a long time to go